So I'm going to be honest, I never was big on dinosaurs. You're not going to get an introduction here explaining the various periods of Earth's history when the dinosaurs reigned supreme. That's not to say I never had an interest in dinosaurs, but that sort of fell apart sometime relatively early on in my childhood. I think the cool factor was replaced by the scary factor later on, and was also just generally supplanted by the idea of space, which seemed much cooler to me. At least with space, we might be able to go up there and see or explore it one day, while with dinosaurs, I mean, they're already dead. And yes, there is some irony in that considering I do like history. It's only been very recently that I've had some interest in dinosaurs return, such as with Sagan Hawk's video on Escape Triassic Hall, or on some other sorts of dinosaur-related alternate universe scenarios. Then of course, there's this series, that being Dinosaurs. Yeah, that's literally the title of the series. Now, you probably fit into one of three camps for this series. You have no clue what I'm talking about, you know a bit about the series because you've seen small clips of it or heard about the ending where... or because you actually watched this show and remember it. This show is from 1991, which we'll get to in a minute, and involves Earl, Fran, Robbie, Charlene, and Baby. This follows a very sitcom-like approach, which was a style at the time. It also has this strangely pseudo-episodic, pseudo-continuous layout to the episode order. I don't really know what to think of shows that do this. So you can usually watch any episode in any order and be fine, but sometimes they'll randomly reference previous episodes or events. I think the only ones that are super mandatory to be watched in the correct order are the first and last episodes that need to be watched at the very beginning and very end. In fact, let's talk about the first episode right now. Episode 1 is titled The Mighty Megalosaurus. That's the species of this character here, named Earl Sinclair. Now if you look at this character and compare him to depictions of an actual Megalosaurus, you'll note that he's a bit bigger around than certain depictions. That's because he's your typical lazy father stereotype. This was the 90s, the early 90s at that, so I'll be giving some of these tropes a pass, since in my opinion they hadn't quite been overdone to death yet. Kinda like how I'm more lenient with the camera controls in Mario 64, because while they weren't great, it was also one of the first 3D games ever. As a quick aside, I like how during this beginning portion, we get some footage like this instead of puppets. I don't think the puppets are bad or anything, but I appreciate this type of gag from time to time, and you actually don't see it all that much in the show. However, this episode is actually about Baby Sinclair and just the whole idea of dinosaurs having proper nuclear families in general. In this flashback, we get the impression that a lot of these things are all fairly new to dinosaurs, from going to school, having actual dinner, going to work, and so on. Let's quickly discuss each character, as well as a few recurring side characters. There actually aren't too many main characters in this series. We have Earl, he isn't all that bright, but he's also, save for a few episodes, the sole income earner for the home. A family of 5 being supported by one income that it seems doesn't pay a ton? Yeah, you can tell that this was the 90s. Oh wait, sorry, I meant 6 once you include Ethel, who gets introduced early on into the series, but we'll get to her in a minute. You can usually tell that Earl cares for his family, particularly his wife, but sometimes he just isn't the best at it or is simply tired from a long day at work. Or he's an idiot. That works too. Earl also has one of his best friends named Roy, so let's talk about him briefly as well. Roy? Well, honestly, he's an idiot. And I know I just said that Earl is an idiot too, but Roy is even more so. Not even a bad idiot. In fact, at times he's really well-intentioned, but more often than not, he makes Earl look smart. Roy's level of stupidity usually ranges from on par with to even greater than Earl's. With that said, they usually get along, and Roy just seems to be an overall really nice character. While we're on the topic of Earl-centric characters, let's talk about Mr. Richfield, Earl's boss. Mr. Richfield is, well, actually kinda evil, honestly. He's sort of a mix between the typical angry boss character and the evil corporate stooge character, but ramped up to an 11. Think of Mr. Burns, and that's somewhat close to what you get here. He isn't remotely subtle about how evil he is, except of course for when it benefits him. Just to name a few examples, are employees expecting a bonus at the end of the year? Well, too bad, bonuses are supposed to be a surprise. wanting to give a gift to an employee. Here's a singular staple. The government requires people to get time off each year. Encourage them to go to a company-branded amusement park that they can't leave. Oh, and that's just the evil corporate stooge side of things. That doesn't even get into the things he does during his off hours. I think what makes him truly sinister is that this isn't all revealed right away. Towards the beginning of the series, he just seems like mean boss. But over the course of the series, it seems like the company he works for, We Say So, has a growing influence, to a point where it becomes a virtual monopoly by the end of things. That or this was just revealed more and more throughout the series. And despite the appearance of things, what with Mr. Richfield spending most of his time in the on-site trailer he calls an office, he actually seems to be very important in this company. Like, top 10 employees important. But anyway, enough about Mr. Richfield. The point is that he's evil. Next we have Fran, Earl's wife. And okay, you already know the trope, Fran is the much smarter half of the couple. This isn't always the case, mind you, since sometimes she makes her own dumb decisions, but she's obviously caring for the family, and she's rather forgiving of Earl's mistakes. That's not to say that she's the perfect character, but she's a nice contrast to Earl, and also makes sure to hopefully keep their kids from going off the rails too. Speaking of which, we have Robbie, Charlene, and Baby Sinclair. And no, that isn't an error in my script. The baby's name is actually just Baby. There's a whole episode about it and everything. Robbie is your typical teenage guy stereotype. He goes to school, has to do homework, he has to howl at the moon. Okay, maybe that last part isn't quite so normal, but we'll get to that. He also asks a lot of questions about life, particularly to his dad, who of course doesn't have all the answers. Or most of them, actually. Robbie doesn't really have any notable friends he's hanging out with all the time that we see on screen. Sure, we get episodes where he makes friends or hangs out with other characters, and he even gets a girlfriend at one point, but we don't usually see any of this outside of those specific episodes. Well, except for one character. This is Spike. Now, when I initially saw Spike, I figured that this would be the typical bad influence character that shows up for one episode and intentionally misguides Robbie. And yeah, that does happen. But Spike actually does show up a few more times throughout the series. And sure, he's a bad influence sometimes, but I think there are also other times where it seems like he's just trying to go off of what's worked for him, or he's just as clueless but doesn't want to admit it. Let's take that example from earlier with the episode where Robbie gets a girlfriend. Spike warns Robbie not to get too involved because all of her previous boyfriends have disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Turns out this rumor was only half true, but Spike was going off of the same bad information. Or how about the steroids episode, because yes, of course there's one of those. You would think that Spike would have encouraged this, but in fact he did the exact opposite, warning Robbie and later on having to take matters into his own hands when Robbie gets out of control. Spike is by no means a perfect character, but he isn't what you'd expect compared to when you first see him. Next we have Charlene. Now honestly, I don't know what to really add about Charlene that I didn't say about Robbie, minus the parts about Spike of course. She probably has friends, but we don't see them on screen, and she's more prone to gossip. She actually doesn't get a ton of screen time compared to her brother, and the stuff we do get, I'm not big on, but we'll get to that later. I guess the only other thing to be added is that while she's somewhat caring, sometimes, she can also be rock stupid.
Could you help me find the continent of Pangea on this map?
And then we have the baby. Gotta love him. He's, the baby, who can also somehow speak relatively fluently from the time he's born. Speaking of his, if you start to notice that he starts to sound more and more like Elmo, that's because he's played by Kevin Clash, the same voice actor for Elmo. So yeah, that's really distracting. Baby Sinclair is for all intents and purposes a comic relief character, though we do get some episodes centered around him. I don't hate him as a character or anything, but there isn't really a ton to talk about except for some of his quirks like calling his dad not the mama, which is pretty clearly done just out of spite. Oh, and let's not forget Ethel, another main character, who is Fran's mother. We get the typical trope of the mother-in-law, son-in-law rivalry, but honestly I think the way those interactions are written are somewhat funny. Ethel obviously outclasses Earl in terms of, intelligence, and something about her sarcastic, I'm done with life demeanor in general is actually entertaining to see. She's also actually a help to the character sometimes, such as when she's able to figure out how to cure Baby Sinclair when he gets sick. I still think, however, that it's her obviously exhausted and done with everything personality that's really her charm. She can and will say whatever she wants to whoever she wants. Alright, and I think that's all the major recurring characters. Well, I guess all except for one, that being Monica de Vertebrae. Now the reason I didn't bring her up earlier is because there's no real connecting character for her, unlike Spike with Robbie. She shows up in the middle of season 2, and there's only 2 real episodes I'd say she plays a big part in. Otherwise, for the most part, it feels like she just pops in to say something and kick the plot in a certain direction before leaving just as quickly, and even then she doesn't pop in all that much. I don't think she's a bad character or anything, mainly just a 90s single female character, but there just isn't much to work off of here. I will say that one of the episodes she does majorly feature in has some pretty good jokes, so that's something. Since I'm obviously not going to cover every single episode of every single season, let's discuss things season by season, starting of course with... Season 1 is the shortest season by far, consisting of only 5 episodes. Most of these episodes are basically world-building episodes, and you know what? They do the job pretty well. I'm pretty sure that this season is so short so that if for some reason it didn't do well, at least the important world-building was already there, instead of being shoved in during the middle of a season that would never be aired. That doesn't mean that there's no world building to be had during the other seasons, but it's more like this one has the most concentrated amount of it all at once. We get introduced to Earl and his family, and how Earl isn't actually very respected despite his claim of being
the mighty Megalosaurus.
We also have the introduction of the baby, but you've heard about all of this already. In a later episode, we're made aware of the mating dance. Well, sort of, though it gets expanded upon in a later episode, and this one's more like an acknowledgement that it exists. We're also introduced to the hurling day concept, and even some of the weird ways this society works. Like I mentioned earlier, the idea of dinosaurs living this way is actually a fairly new concept. So then you get these sort of weird things that are mashed together, where you have this society that acts in a certain way, but then out of nowhere there's a rule stating that a bigger dinosaur can just eat a smaller one and take his wife. For some reason. In fact, I'll say that out of these 5 world-building episodes in Season 1, High Noon is the weakest. Don't get me wrong, it's still a good episode, but the problem is that this entire rule is brought up once and never again from what I can recall. I think the most I can give the episode is that it's supposed to show that the dinosaurs aren't quite as civilized as they sometimes like to claim. And finally, there's the episode The Howling, where male dinosaurs have to go up to a certain area once per month and howl at the moon. If they don't, then their moods greatly worsen and they fight a lot. The show not so subtly tries to compare this to, well, periods, to a point where they call the frustration that males get before howling as pre-howling syndrome, or PHS. Yeah, not very subtle, but I guess it's the thought that counts. It's interesting as a bit of contrast between this episode and Hurling Day, because while in both cases Robbie was wondering why certain things had to be the way they were, in this instance it was obvious that the howling existed for a good reason, even if it had been exaggerated by quite a bit. While in Hurling Day, they'd just sort of throw people away for the sake of it, and Robbie was right to say that it was stupid. Going forward, I'll only talk about a few episodes per season, so let's move on to Season 2. Season 2 expands upon where Season 1 left off, and while there's less world building, the episodes are still generally good all the same. You can tell that the show has gotten out of its strictly, we have to establish everything about this world phase. I think my favorite episodes have to be When Food Goes Bad, Refrigerator Day, The Last Temptation of Ethel, and Nuts to War. Meanwhile, my least favorites are The Clip Show and Charlene's Tale. When Food Goes Bad requires a bit of explanation to start off. So the dinosaurs have started storing their food in the fridge, but the food is still alive in there, and it's just really cold. Well, this is when the creatures that have been designated as food decide to, well, go rogue. Honestly, it's just a really unique episode with lots of creative moments. We don't get to see a ton from the mammals in this show, and seeing that along with having some of what is in my opinion really good moments just makes this an enjoyable episode. It isn't the most creative episode in the world, since there's the typical the parents went out and then there's no response at home trope, but I really just like this episode. I think it's just really well done and a rather unique episode for the series. Next up we have Refrigerator Day. 2 episodes in a row about the fridge. This event is a dinosaur equivalent of Christmas, but in this case they celebrate the existence of the fridge. So, okay, great, a Christmas special. Why is that a big deal? Well, this also introduces the concept of returning bought items to, well, all of dinosaurs really. And I personally just found that, not to mention the entire episode in general, rather funny. The Last Temptation of Ethel is the episode where Ethel dies, but apparently too early. Things such as Earl and Roy burying her early, only for her to literally have to crawl out of her grave, or how she gets put on a mystery show that only ever has 4 mysteries are pretty funny to me. Also, there's this not very subtle remark about a puppet show on the other channel.
I want to watch the puppet show on the other channel.
That's a kid's show.
Not so. They do some very sophisticated juxtapositions of reality.
But this is also the episode where Ethel accidentally kickstarts televangelism. And you know how much everyone loves that, right? Luckily, she gets warned in time what will happen to her if she continues trying to push the afterlife to others by means of trying to sell it. Oh yeah, and also something about living life to the fullest. We have Nuts to War, a parody of, something I'm sure. So I checked, and apparently it's supposed to be a parody of The Winds of War, or rather the opening sequence is a parody at least. And The Winds of War is based on a novel of the same name, which is about World War II. So we have a parody of a miniseries based on a book about World War II. Although I mentioned that it was only the title sequence that's the parody portion, because I'm personally not getting a real World War II vibe to this episode. In fact, more than anything, I'd say it's closer to World War I, what with the trench warfare and rapidly advancing technology of the war. Anyway, this is your typical war bad episode, so why is it up there as one of my favorites of this season? Well, honestly, it's just a funny episode, or I guess technically a series of episodes. It's mainly just a lot of not at all subtle jokes about war being bad, and also as it turns out, the media was lying to the public and just how badly the war was going. Yeah, never seen that before. Also, the government trying to censor speech dissenting to the continuation of the war. Okay, are we sure this isn't a mashup of World War I and Vietnam? Because it's really starting to sound like it. And all of this because the dinosaurs couldn't get pistachios. I mean, how ridiculous is that? All these dead dinosaurs for what? Obviously, it's far more practical to fight over the remains of dead dinosaurs now. One quick honorable mention is also going to be A New Leaf. It's a typical early 90s drugs are bad episode, and for the most part it's just fine. But it's what they do at the end that I find really funny. You think they're going to tell you how bad drugs are, and while they do a bit of that, the general gist of it is, hey, stop doing drugs so we don't have to make more anti-drug PSAs, which I personally thought was a hilarious twist. Finally, I wanted to throw in the episode, and the winner is... In this episode, the Chief Elder dies, which not only gives baby Sinclair the official name of Og I'm Dying You Idiot Sinclair, but also means that there's going to be an election taking place. So Mr. Richfield decides to run because of course he does, along with Earl as his opposition. Also, something I've been meaning to mention is that a recurring voice actor in this show is Michael Dorn, who's better known for his role as Worf on Star Trek. Well, every single time I hear him voice act, I keep thinking of Worf saying these things, such as reading out a campaign ad for Mr. Richfield. Worf, don't you know that Mr. Richfield is without honor? Sorry, I got sidetracked. Back to the episode though. Eventually, Earl decides that he can't just coast along and lose the entire time, mainly for fear of what Mr. Richfield might do as Chief Elder. He manages to make it through by basically saying what people want to hear, but then his conscience kicks back in, and he realizes that he isn't fit for the position. Oh yeah, also in his dream he ends the world. Finally, debate night comes around between someone who's completely incompetent for the job versus a corrupt businessman and... Wait a second, I think I watched this one before. The only part of this entire episode that's completely unrealistic, you know, aside from all the talking dinosaurs, was that everyone decided to vote third party. Yeah, that'll be the day. Now time for the bad episodes. Let's begin with Charlene's tail. So for the first while in the series, Charlene only has a much smaller tail, closer to a stub. This is followed by this episode, making not very subtle implications that Dinosaur's tail is the equivalent of a human female's boobs. For example, the male characters are ogling a model dinosaur on TV, specifically mentioning her tail, to which Ethel responds that real tails don't hang that way. We even get a segment where Charlene has bought an obviously fake tail to try and impress others. So I'm going to give you about 5 seconds to guess what the major flaw in this episode is. They all have tails! That's the major issue with this episode. Your whole analogy sort of falls apart when every single character, male and female, have tails in this universe. Next up, we have the clip show. While not exactly a bad episode, I can't say I'm a fan. It's basically just clips from the show interspersed with some sections from the modern era about paleontology. It's somewhat funny at times, but I don't know, maybe I've just never been a big fan of clip show episodes to begin with. It's fine enough, I guess, but not much more. Honestly, I think Season 3 is probably the weakest season. That's not to say it's a bad season or anything, and I still find it rather decent, but it's sort of stuck between the highlights of Season 4 and Season 2, and it doesn't have quite the same world building as the other seasons, so it feels much more episodic. For the best episodes of this season, we have Germ Warfare, Wilderness Weekend, The Sun Also Rises, and Network Genius. Meanwhile, for the least favorite episodes, we have Honey, I Missed the Kids, Baby Talk, and The Clip Show 2. To begin with Germ Warfare, this one is pretty simple. Baby Sinclair gets sick, they have to go to the doctor who gives them medicine which only exacerbates the issue, before after a bunch of Ethels saying they should, they finally go to see a guy in the woods who cures the illness with moldy bread. Okay, that doesn't sound like a bad episode, but maybe not great either. So why is it up there with my favorites? Well, honestly, I think it's because the jokes landed here for the most part, such as Baby spinning his head around like this, or after the doctor comes to their house and realizes they won't be able to pay, he has an assessor already waiting. Mind you, not every joke lands in this episode, but I think that's what really saved this episode. Maybe not the most creative episode ever, but I personally enjoyed it. Next is Wilderness Weekend. In this episode, all the males are to go and participate in the Great Hunt, part of which involves the reenactment of hunting and slaying a larger dinosaur. Except, oops, the actual larger dinosaur shows up, and they have to end up hiding in a cave. Meanwhile, all the females decide to sit at home, drink beer, and watch sports. So basically, this is sort of like a role reversal episode, something we'll actually get back to in another episode here. Not entirely though, as there is an attempt made at hunting, mainly by Robbie, and there are the typical jokes of delusion that comes with them having literally no food to eat. Toward the end of the episode, the males are talking about their feelings over cups of coffee, meanwhile the females go in and save them, and are notably drunk. Honestly, I think this episode had some really funny moments, and no downsides that I can really think of. The Sun Also Rises is another sort of role reversal episode, but this time taking place between father and son. Robbie gets sick of his dad's rules, and so has to fight his dad for control of the house. And after he does, he gets burdened and overwhelmed with all that it takes to be in that position. This is apparently another one of those ancient rituals that's been randomly shoehorned into this modern society, complete with an office where one fills out forms to make this battle happen. Okay, modern might be a bit of a stretch, but you get what I mean. However, this ends up being a benefit to Earl, who no longer has to work. Initially, Robbie actually does okay, but by the end of the month, he's clearly not handling it well. So finally, he begs Earl to switch back to things as they were, and Earl says no. Eventually, he's coaxed into agreeing, however, and things are back to normal. This episode is quite good, both with its story as well as its jokes. I find some of these types of episodes interesting, as well as actually rather nice. Finally, for the good episodes, we have Network Genius. This one is rather simple, where Earl is put in charge of a TV network after ratings had been dropping. This being Earl, of course, he puts on some of the dumbest TV shows that exist, such as Test Patterns and one literally called The Happy Colors Show. It was neat to see some short snippets of other show ideas in this episode as well, including what they tried to do in the later portions of the episode. But unfortunately, all of the stupid TV shows are making the population, well, stupid. While this earns Earl an award, this also risks quite literally destroying civilization. Eventually they decide to start putting on smarter TV shows, which works to undo the effect, but also causes people to stop watching TV, because instead they want to start learning things from books. The funniest twist though, at the end the TV executives come up with their own book to try and get people watching TV again. The TV Guide. Okay, so for those who aren't aware, there used to be this thing called a TV Guide, which was a booklet you'd receive which would show many of the upcoming shows. Wait a second, half of you probably don't even remember much about a digital TV guide, let alone a TV Guide booklet. This episode is actually really funny to me, in part due to the complete 180 in TV programming, going from the Happy Colors show to shows like Economics Hoedown. I also just find it really entertaining when the entirety of society somehow started collapsing all over a few TV shows, and pretty quickly too. I think this episode takes place over the span of maybe a week or two at most. Now then, it's time for the not so good episodes. To start off, we have Honey, I Miss the Kids. This is another role reversal episode, but unfortunately it isn't nearly as good as the others. This involves Fran getting sick of being at the house all day and wanting to get a job, even though she kinda already did that before in a previous episode. However, after Roy tells Earl that she'd come crawling back after missing the kids, he agrees to this switch. It doesn't help that Earl also agreed to take on the night shift at work, however. So the problem here is that instead of the benefits of each situation being realized during the switch, they're assumed beforehand, which I feel sort of diminishes the impact the other role reversal episodes had. That's not to say this episode is bad, since there's still some genuinely good jokes and moments in here, but it could be better. It also has a really touching ending, so look, again, I don't think most of these bad episodes are really bad, but just less good. I think the only reason I don't care for this episode more than the others is simply because it has two role reversal episodes in the same season to compete with, and I just think this one happens to be the weakest one. Then we have Baby Talk. Baby Sinclair learns a bad word. Yeah, that's basically it. Also, as a bit of an aside, can I just say that most shows do fake bad words in a stupid way? That's part of why episodes like Sailor Mouth from SpongeBob still work, but lots of other character says a bad word episodes don't. In SpongeBob, they censored all the words with specific noises. We also get the impression that these are actual swear words because of it, and not just something made up. In this episode though, the word is smoo. Now look, I'm no swear word linguist or anything, but usually swear words have a bit more bite to them. Smoo sounds like a word made up for this specific purpose and nothing more, not a real swear word. But since this word, and later others, are on TV, this forces Earl to spend more time with Baby. Except when that doesn't work, he decides to protest to the network. I'll also note that this episode is right before the one where Earl gets hired to make decisions on network TV. And then since the network won't listen, he decides to go to the government to solve the problem. Oh, I know where this is going. The government then decides to ban certain words from TV, before later deciding to ban all words they don't like, everywhere. Also, Earl gets forced to wear pants because the government said so. Needless to say, this has all backfired, and that's basically how the episode ends. Yeah, there's no real resolution except Baby Sinclair decides to not say the word anymore because he doesn't feel like it. Earl learns that it's important to spend time with his family and not have the government take away everyone's freedoms. Honestly, not a bad message, arguably even a relevant one, so what's the problem with this episode? Well, again, the ending was rather abrupt, but honestly, I've just never cared for most episodes with these fake bad words and characters making a big deal of it. The whole conflict just seems a bit shoehorned in. And like I said before, none of the bad words have any real bite to them, so the whole thing feels more or less unneeded. And the final least favorite episode is the Clip Show 2. Honestly though, even this episode I can't say I hate. It's certainly more creative than the original clip show episode, instead acting as a mix of a clip show episode and a fake advertisement for learning to be a paleontologist. In fact, despite it being a clip show episode, it was somewhat enjoyable. My only real issue with it is, well, the fact that it's still a clip show episode. I obviously prefer this version though, since they actually did something different here. I think Season 4 is the one with the most ups and downs. There were episodes in here that I actually thought were really good, such as Monster Under the Bed, Georgie Must Die, and Changing Nature, but it also has some less good ones, such as Scent of a Reptile, The Greatest Story Ever Told, or Life in the Faust Lane. Let's start with Monster Under the Bed. Now, okay, this one is sort of predictable, with the idea being that there would actually be a monster under the bed. I think my favorite part of the episode is the way that they treat the whole scenario upon finding out. They get an entire police presence and hostage negotiator. Of course, since they're incompetent, they almost screwed the whole thing up. While perhaps not the greatest or most groundbreaking episode ever, I thought it was a fun twist on what I had initially expected from it. Next up is Georgie Must Die. And this one requires a little bit of background, both real world and in universe. So I assume most of you have at least heard of Barney the dinosaur. Well, this was around the peak of Barney's popularity, and many people did not like him. He was obnoxious, overboard, and from what I could tell was seemingly everywhere for a time. In universe, this show had a character clearly riffing on Barney called Blarney.
Yes, it's Blarney.
He'd only show up for a short bit at a time, but in this episode he was changed up a bit. Now, this could be for a variety of reasons, such as Blarney being too close to Barney to a point where they were afraid of messing up the name and having to do a bunch of retakes. However, I think the real reason is, well, we'll get to that in a moment. This episode involves Baby Sinclair wanting to go see Georgie, this universe's new stand-in for Barney. However, since the line is too long, Earl initially refuses, until he realizes he can do a perfect impression of Georgie. So he fashions a fake Georgie costume, and does what Georgie would have done for Baby. That is, until the copyright police show up. They somehow found out that Earl had been doing a Georgie impression in his own home. I also think this is a bit explaining why it's Georgie now instead of Blarney. I think that the producers of the show must have gotten a letter telling them to stop since Blarney was just a bit too on the nose, though I could be mistaken as I'm only guessing. Earl gets arrested, and then we find out that Georgie is actually evil and is going to take over the market, and soon the world. Luckily, Earl gets freed by the parents' resistance, and after talking to Fran and Roy, he manages to sneak into the Georgie studios and pretend to be Georgie on stage for a bit, before him and Georgie end up fighting. Also, Roy wanders on stage and starts singing Brick House. Yeah, alright, that works, Roy. Meanwhile, Earl is still fighting, and he ends up doing this.
This is for all you parents at home.
I know it isn't Barney being knocked out here, but it's close enough and it's wonderful. Oh yeah, also Georgie got arrested for tax evasion, and Earl was pardoned. Before we move on to the other good episode, let's take a look at some of Season 4's bad episodes. First off, we have Scent of a Reptile. This is another Charlene episode that I don't care for. In fact, I find it interesting that two of my least favorite episodes from the entire series happen to be Charlene-centered episodes. Basically, this involves her growing a scent gland, which will supposedly attract the mate she'll have for the rest of her life. It turns out this smells like burning tires, which the janitor of the school just loves. So this means Charlene has to find a way to change this, and upon going on a journey to find a rare plant which could solve her problem, she finds that the only place with them has had a lone film development store built on top of it, in the middle of nowhere. At least this part of the episode was actually pretty funny since it was just the most random thing ever. However, she manages to change things anyway simply by going on said adventure, I guess. So, problem solved. Now, while I don't think this was as bad as the other Charlene episode, it still wasn't all that great. At least it didn't have a major plot hole staring it right in the face, unlike the other Charlene episode. With this next episode, I'd like to remind everyone that, save for rare exceptions, none of these episodes are bad. More just less good than the others. This episode, titled The Greatest Story Ever Sold, is about everyone wondering where dinosaurs came from, and is causing an existential crisis until everyone is basically forced by the government into a cult that worships a potato because why not? Or, excuse me, because potatoes. Now, this episode is entertaining, even somewhat funny, but my big problem with this episode is a plot hole. Shouldn't the Book of Dinosaur have covered this already or something? Oh well, it's still a decent episode all the same. And for the final bad, or I guess rather less good episode, we have Life in the Faust Lane. Okay, just by the title alone, you can guess what's going to happen in the episode, and if not, you'll realize it within minutes of starting the episode. Earl is happy until he isn't and covets what others have. He sells his soul to the dinosaur devil for a collector's mug, he takes things overboard until he loses everything he once loved, and then he begs for the devil to undo it. Yeah, not exactly the most inspired episode ever, and honestly, I think The Simpsons did this bit better during Treehouse of Horror, where Homer gets a soul donut from Flanders. Also Hell's Kitchen reference.
Wrong!
That's not to say that this episode is devoid of humor, far from it in fact. I like just how overboard Earl went to make sure this mug was protected, as well as how everyone just stops caring at the end. So not really a bad episode, but just sort of predictable. And now for the grand finale, that being Changing Nature. This is probably the episode most people know this show for. So the short version is that the We Say So Corporation manages to screw up the environment. They destroyed the habitat of the bunch beetles by building a factory where their mating grounds are. Anyway, this causes these poppies to grow out of control, which the bunch beetles normally take care of. We Say So is about to get in trouble for this when suddenly Earl steps into their defense because he's a moron. He gets put in charge of solving the problem, so they spray poison all across the continent. So basically all of Earth, to destroy the poppies. Robbie and Charlene object, suggesting something that might not destroy the entire planet, but it's a bit late anyway. This works in destroying the poppies, but also all other plant life on the entire planet. So the next task is to get the plants back. Maybe planting some would be a good start. I refuse to believe there were no leftover seeds at all. Instead, however, they decide on making rain. And to do that, they need clouds. So they need to create clouds somehow. Wait a second, are they actually planning? Yeah, so they force a bunch of volcanoes to erupt by dropping bombs in them. Even Earl is having doubts about this plan, but it goes forward anyway, and then causes a massive cooling event, and also doesn't even solve the problem. Mr. Richfield doesn't even care about any of this, instead being happy about how many people are buying We Say So brand heaters and blankets. And it gets to a point of him saying that the end of the world is a problem for next quarter. Earl finally apologizes to everyone for ruining the entire world, and how he's learned that there shouldn't be an over-reliance on technology, and that the planet needs to be taken care of properly. And so the episode, and by extension the show, ends with Earl being hopeful everything will work out because dinosaurs have lived on Earth for so long, and they won't just disappear. Wow, do I have bad news for Earl there. Unlike the much more upbeat credits song we normally get, we instead get a calming but also sad sounding music track. It's quite a sad ending, but also a rather fitting one. And honestly, I think it's a very good way to wrap up the series. The episode had share of humor, but was also overall just a good episode, and very important to the series. Now, for the big question, just how well known is Dinosaurs? Well, honestly, not very from what I can tell. Sure, back in the day it was popular enough to get 4 seasons, but what about now? Well, not really, which is somewhat surprising, but also does make some sense. So to reiterate, I've seen actual Dinosaurs content in the wild in only 2 instances. One is about the literal ending to the show, and the other is this section from the very beginning of the show where Earl drops his beer in shock, usually used as a reaction gif. That's literally all I've ever seen, and those are both from the bookends of this series. I think there's a reason that this series isn't well remembered though. To start off, the title. Dinosaurs honestly isn't the most original name in the world, and can easily lead to confusion. It's just too generic. That'd be like naming a series, I don't know, Cars or something. Okay, maybe a bad example. But seriously, even just looking for this show is difficult enough. I mean, you're looking for that one dinosaur show, and it's to a point where you have to specify the year to have much of any hope at finding it. Even just a subtitle or something might have gone a long way. Next, most of the puppets were done by Jim Henson Productions, which sounds good at first because what else is Jim Henson known for? That's right, the Muppets. Except that's exactly the issue. Right now, we're in a veritable Muppet drought, to a point where Muppet fans get excited by the idea of Kermit starring in a commercial for someone's Ponzi scheme. But back in the 90s though, the Muppets were not only doing well, they were riding high. As such, instead of the Muppets and Jim Henson Productions helping to prop up the show, instead I feel as if in the long run it crippled it. Finally, there's simply the way the show is structured. It feels sort of like a mix of The Simpsons in terms of some of its humor and at times episode pacing, but also like your average late 80s or early 90s sitcom. And as much as I like the show, I'm going to be honest here and say that I don't think it quite commits well enough to either. Sure, I appreciate that the show has no problem with getting its hands dirty sometimes, much like The Simpsons, but I still can't shake the feeling that there's always something that feels off about it. Something I do appreciate about this show, unlike The Simpsons, is that it actually ended. Avid Simpsons fans will tell you that only the first 6 to 8 seasons are actually good, depending on who you ask, and it was all down from there. Could Dinosaurs have gone on for another season, maybe even 2? It's certainly a possibility, but I've also grown to appreciate shows that end arguably too early, instead of ones that go on far too long. Is the show campy at times? Yeah. Is it even silly? Of course. Is every episode perfect? No, you'll find a few duds in there. But do I think it's a good show that everyone should watch? Absolutely. And hey, let me know what you think of this show, if you've ever watched or even heard of it. Well, that's all for now. Thank you all for watching, and take care.